welcome to the Russian Empire History Podcast, the history of all the peoples of the Russian Empire. I'm your host, J.P. Bristow, and this is Season 1, The Forest, the Steppe, and the Birth of the Russian Empire, and Episode 65, Enter the Mongols. Before we begin, thank you to new boyars, Steve, Benjamin, and Mark, to Tsar Muhammad for his continuing generous support, and to anyone signing up on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. There are now 20 member episodes available, and coming up for this year we will have the Mongol conquest of Central Asia and medieval Poland. Welcome back to Rus. A decade has passed since we were last here, but little has changed. Just a few new faces among the knyazes. Vsevolod's death had resulted in a succession conflict among his sons, caused by him leaving Vladimir to his younger son Yuri, rather than the eldest, Constantine. Eventually, after several false starts, it came to all-out war among the brothers, which ended with Constantine as Grand Knyaz of Vladimir and an agreement that his brother Yuri would rule in Suzdal until he succeeded Constantine. Constantine died just 5 months later, in early 1218, and Yuri became the Grand Knyaz as agreed. This succession was peaceful, and the only significant incidents recorded over the next few years involved the Bulgars. As you'll recall, the previous round of serious conflict between Suzdalia and the Bulgars appeared to end with the Bulgars having the upper hand. There had been a couple of minor raids in each direction under Vsevolod, but now the Bulgars took the town of Ustyug on the Sikhona and continued along the Unja to try to take the town of the same name. This required a strong response from Yuri, which came in 1220. He dispatched his brother Sviatoslav with troops from Pereyaslavl, Rostov, Ustyug, and Murom, and they took the river to the Bulgar town of Oshil, seizing it and pillaging the land around it. The Bulgars immediately sent a peace embassy, but Yuri ignored it and began planning a second raid. It took 3 embassies to get him to agree to accept a peace. To strengthen his border, Yuri built a new fortress at the confluence of the Volga and Oka, founding the town of Nizhny Novgorod. Meanwhile, in the other Novgorod, Mstislav Mstislavich Udatny had ruled with minor interruptions for 10 years. In 1217, however, he announced that he was going to acquire new possessions in Galicia and transferred the city to another Rostislavich, Sviatoslav, the son of Mstislav Romanovich, who, as we saw back in episode 59, was now ruling in Kiev. This led to problems in Novgorod. Udatny's authority had been sufficient to control the boyars, but now rival factions of pro-Rostislavich and pro-Suzdalian boyars were once again competing for influence. Sviatoslav lost control of the situation almost immediately, and Mstislav of Kiev had to replace him with another son, Vsevolod, who had already been in charge of Pskov and therefore had more experience. He faced a religious crisis when rival bishops claimed Novgorod. The matter eventually had to be submitted to the Metropolitan, who confirmed the pro-Rostislavich Mitrofan in Novgorod and sent his rival Antony to Peremyshl. A more serious conflict arose in 1219, when Vsevolod came into conflict with the Posadnik. Both sides were already in armor and ready to fight when Mitrofan managed to persuade the Posatnik to step down and become a monk. The chronicle does not tell us what the conflict was about, but in 1221 the townspeople demanded Vsevolod leave and sent a delegation to Vladimir to ask Yuri for a new knyaz. The Rostislavichi would never hold Novgorod again. So now the scene is set. This episode is going to be a bit of a throwback to the early Rus episodes because we're going to start with the chronicle, unpack what it is telling us, how it's usually interpreted, and then go back and look at how more recent Mongolian scholarship gives us a different way to look at some of what happened. So let's get into it. This is going to be quite a long quote, and this comes from the Chronicle of Novgorod, the entry for 1224. Quote, "The same year, for our sins, unknown tribes came, whom no one exactly knows, who they are or where they come from, what their language is or what their race is or what their faith is. Some call them Tatars, others Taurmen, others Pechenik, while others say they are the ones Bishop Methody of Patmos spoke of, who came out of the Etrian desert between the east and north. As Methody says, at the end of time, those whom Gideon scattered will appear, and they will subdue the whole land from the east to the Euphrates, and from the Tigris to the Pontus, except Ethiopia. God alone knows who they are and where they come from. Very wise men who read books know who they are, but we do not know who they are. We have written about them here for the sake of the memory of the Russian knyazes and the misfortune they brought to them. For we have heard they captured many countries, slaughtered the Yas, Arbez, Kasog, Polovtsi, and scattered others, who all died, killed thus by the wrath of God and his Immaculate Mother. For those accursed Polovtsi people had wrought much evil to the Russian land. Therefore the all-merciful God wished to destroy the Kuman people, godless sons of Ishmael, that they might atone for the blood of Christians that they had spilled, the lawless ones. For those Taurmen people passed through the whole Kuman country and came close to Russia, where it is called the Polovets Wall, and the cursed Polovtsi, the survivors, with Kotyan and the other knyazes, escaped to Rus, while Kobyakovits and Gyurgi were killed, and with them a quantity of the Polovtsi. And this Kotyan was father-in-law to Mstislav of Halych, and he came with the Polovtsi knyazes and greetings to his son-in-law Mstislav in Halych, and to all the Rus knyazes, and brought many gifts, horses, camels, buffalo, and girls, and gave these gifts to the Rus knyazes, saying, They have taken our land today, and they will take yours tomorrow. And Kotyan appealed to his son-in-law, and Mstislav began to appeal to the other Rus knyazes, his brethren, saying, If we do not help them, my brothers, they will surrender to the Taurmen, and their strength will be greater. So, having deliberated among themselves, they were persuaded by the appeal of the Polovtsi knyazes, and made themselves ready to travel. Each began to organize his forces in his own province, and then, having gathered the whole of the Rus land against the Tatars, they went to the Dnieper at Zarub. When they had learned the Rus were coming against them, the Tatars sent envoys to the Rus knyazes. We have heard that you are coming against us because you have listened to the Polovtsi, but we have not occupied your land, your towns, or your villages, nor have we come against you. We have been sent by God against our serfs, our horse herds, the Polovtsi, You should make peace with us. If they escape to you, drive them off and take their goods for yourselves. For we have heard that they have also done much harm to you, and that is also why we are fighting them." But the Rus knyazes did not listen. They killed all the envoys and went against them. They took a stand on the Dnieper at Oleshe. The Tatars sent envoys a second time, saying, "Since you have listened to the Polovtsi and killed all our envoys, and are coming against us even though we have not touched you, come on then and let God judge." They let the envoys go free, and Mstislav forded the Dnieper with 1,000 men, attacked the Tatar outposts, and defeated them. They fled with their voivoda, Genya Beg, to the Polovets kurgan, and there they could not hold out, so they buried their voivoda, Genya Beg, alive in the earth, wishing to preserve his life. And there the Polovtsi, who had begged permission from Mstislav, found him and killed him. When they heard this, the Rus knyazes all crossed the Dnieper and chased the Tatars for 9 days to the Kalka River. Sending Yarun and the Polovtsi forward as outposts, they took up a position as an advance. Yarun came back, wishing to fight, but the Polovtsi ran away without accomplishing anything, trampling the camp of the Rus knyazes as they went. They had not yet formed up and were thrown into confusion and savage slaughter. Mstislav, the knyaz of Kiev, saw this evil and kept to his position, where he had set up a stockade on a hill overlooking the Kalka. He fought with them from the stockade for 3 days. The Tatars pursued the Rus knyazes, fighting them as far as the Dnieper, but voivodas Tsigir and Teshukan stayed at the stockade fighting Mstislav, his son-in-law, Andrei, and Alexander of Dubrovitz, for these 2 knyazes were with Mstislav. And there were men in armour with the Tatars and voivoda Ploskina, and these accursed voivodas, having kissed the cross to Mstislav and both the knyazes not to kill them but to let them go on a ransom, lied, the accursed ones. He delivered them bound to the Tatars, and he took the stockade and slaughtered the people. Having taken the knyazes, they suffocated them by placing them under boards, then took their seats on top to have their dinner. Thus they ended their lives. Pursuing the other knyazes to the Dnieper, they killed 6: Sviatoslav of Yanev, Izyaslav Ingevorets, Sviatoslav Shumsky, Mstislav of Chernihiv and his son, and Georgy of Nezvezh. Mstislav Mstislavich managed to escape across the Dnieper and cut loose the boats from the banks so the Tatars could not go after them. From the rest of the troops, every 10th returned to his home. Some the Polovtsi killed for their horses, others for their clothes. And thus, for our sins, God put misunderstanding into us, and a countless number of people perished, and there was lamentation and weeping and grief throughout the towns and villages. This evil happened on May 31st, on St. Jeremy's Day, and the Tatars turned back from the Dnieper, and we do not know where they came from or where they went to. God knows where he brought them from against us for our sins." End quote. This is not the only resource we have on the first Mongol invasion, but it is the fullest. The Lavrentian Chronicle is a copy of the lost Kievan Chronicle and takes the tone that the invasion was a far-off event that did not really concern Susdalia, whose knyazes, you'll note, are not mentioned in the extract we've just heard. The Partivsky Chronicle is based on the lost Chernihiv Chronicle, and mainly sets the scene for the future heroic exploits of knyazes Daniil and Vasilko. The Sofisky First Codex focuses on the Rostislavichi, which is interpreted as meaning that it's based on an earlier Smolensk text. As we've previously discussed, all these texts reflect the prejudices and propaganda requirements of their writers. A couple of things probably jumped out straight away listening to this extract. The chronicler seriously disparages the Polovtsi, calling them godless sons of Ishmael and lawless ones, even though the Polovtsi in question are related by marriage to the Rus knyazes and come to warn them about the invasion. The Mongols are presented as God's instruments sent to punish the Polovtsi for everything they've done against the Rus, as well as the Rus for their unspecified sins. Of course, it's fairly typical for medieval chroniclers to attribute anything bad that happens to God's punishment for some kind of sins, but the language about the Polovtsi is notably harsher than that about the Mongols. Not all of the chroniclers take this position. The Epatovsky Chronicle claims that the leader of the Polovtsi converted to Christianity before setting out to fight the Mongols, and the Safisky has nothing to say against them either. So, if we look at the traditional narrative, which is strongly based on the chronicles, it starts out that after the conquest of Central Asia, a detachment of Mongols was sent west on what is frequently called the Great Raid and described as a reconnaissance in force. It's often said that this was led by the general Subutai, often called the Mongols' greatest general, but it was actually led by his mentor, Jebe, at least to start with. This Mongol army, numbering between 20 and 25,000, set off from their camp on the Caspian and fought their way across the Caucasus and into the western steppe, where they then took on the Polovtsi. This brings us up to where our extract from the chronicle begins. The Mongols attack the Polovtsi, who suffer serious losses. Kotian, a Polovtsian Khan, brings lavish gifts of animals and girls, as well as tidings of the disaster to his son-in-law, the Rus knyaz, Mstislav Udatny, who, as noted in the introduction, has moved from Novgorod to Halych. Mstislav is impressed with the gifts and takes the warnings seriously. He calls a council with Mstislav Romanovich of Kiev and Mstislav Sviatoslavich of Chernihiv. Yes, it seems like everyone was called Mstislav at this time. Together, they decide that the Rus forces should join with the Polovtsi and take the attack to the Mongols, rather than waiting for them to cross the Dnieper. The Mongols learn of this and send their envoys to try to persuade the Rus that their only enemies are the Polovtsi. The Rus execute the messengers. Reinforcements arrive from Smolensk, and they continue to the bend of the Dnieper at Protolochi, where there was a large ford. Here they meet with more Mongol envoys, who tell them that since they've thrown in their lot with the Polovtsi and killed the envoys, God will be their judge. The Rus do not appear to have appointed any of the knyazes as commander-in-chief, and they split their forces. The troops from Halych and Volhynia go by boat, while those from Chernihiv and Kiev go by land. The Polovtsi go on ahead. The Mongols are moving east. Udatny catches up with their rear guard, a small force commanded by someone called Genyabek or Hamabek, depending on the chronicle, that has been left behind to track the Rus movements. The Rus cross the river and destroy this Mongol contingent, with the Polovtsi accompanying him being especially keen to kill the Mongol commander. The main Mongol force then leads the Rus on a 9-day feigned retreat until they reach the river Kalka, where they turn. The Rus are caught by surprise, without their forces in position, The Polovtsi are routed and flee through the arriving Rus forces, causing chaos. The Mongols surround and defeat the confused Chernihiv troops before the Kievan forces could arrive. Mstislav of Kiev arrives in time to see the other Rus forces collapse and sets up a stockade on a hill. He thinks he has agreed a truce with the Mongols, but they betray him and execute him and his knyazes according to Mongol tradition, crushing them without spilling their blood. Mstislav Udatny manages to escape home with 1 man in 10 of the original army. After this, the Mongols return to Central Asia, where they are greeted with great acclaim. Subutai's raid enters history as the greatest cavalry expedition ever. The battle on the Khalkha goes into history as a massive and disastrous defeat for the Rus. This traditional narrative essentially takes the chronicle at face value, and as we've seen before, that can sometimes be problematic. So let's unpack it a bit more and see what we can find. The chronicle does not give us much detail about the whole series of events, and some of the details it does provide are not explained. What kind of forces were involved, for example? The Novgorodian chronicle doesn't provide any figures. The other chronicles give conventional numbers: 500 from Smolensk, 10,000 from Kiev. As you already be aware, numbers like this are not intended to be taken literally. They only tell us that the chronicler considered the campaign a substantial undertaking. Similarly, the only 1 in 10 soldiers make it back means nothing more than the Rus were defeated and should not be taken as even close to literally true. Some historians have claimed that the Rus forces totaled 80 to 100,000 troops. This became a common number among Soviet historians because it was necessary to exaggerate the scale of Russia's defeat as a victim for ideological reasons. Other historians have had a tendency to exaggerate the scale of Mongol achievements, but these numbers are not even close to credible. As we've discussed earlier, when all the Rus knyazes gathered together, they were probably capable of fielding a combined army of 50 to 60,000 men, counting both their retinues of professional warriors and their town militias. Volga Bulgaria could raise 20 to 25,000. The Polovtsi forces were smaller than either. In the case we're discussing, I think you will have all noted that not all the leading knyazes were involved. There was no mention of Novgorod or Pskov. Most importantly, there's no mention of Suzdalia, probably the strongest single knyazhestvo. The Ipatevsky Chronicle does note that Yuri of Suzdal was not at the War Council in Kiev. Even the Suzdalian Chronicle only states that they sent a token force that did not get there in time. So the Rus army was in no way the full force of Rus. We have troops from the south and the west, plus the Polovtsi. It's highly unlikely that they outnumbered the Mongols, and quite probable that the total force was smaller. Let's take a bracket of 10 to 20,000, with somewhere in the middle of that being the most likely. As well as only half the Rus turning up, I think we can say there is a general impression of a lack of coordination and poor planning. The Ipatevsky Chronicle even claims there was a feud among the 3 Mstislavs, and that they gave out their orders without informing each other what their troops were doing. This fits with the Rus contingents getting caught out without support from each other. As far as the losses go, we get a list of the knyazes who were killed: Mstislav of Kiev and his son Andrei, Sviatoslav of Kanev, Mstislav of Chernihiv and his son Dmitry, a couple from Shumsk, a couple from Turov, one of unknown origin. The chronicle says that this is half the knyazes that were involved. A loss of half the army might be a reasonable maximum estimate. Let's go back to that extract again. Who are the bad guys there? As already noted, it doesn't really seem to be the Mongols, does it? They are strangers appearing from who knows where to do God's will and punish the Polovtsi and Rus for their sins. The real bad guys for this chronicler are the Rus allies, the Polovtsi, who he calls cursed, godless sons of Ishmael who have wrought much evil. Let's remember that the chronicler is talking here about Mstislav Udatny's father-in-law and his men, so it would be more natural for us to assume that everyone involved was on pretty good terms. Do you think that if the Rus had really just gone through one of their all-time greatest defeats, with the entire Rus military destroyed by an unknown force of overwhelming superiority, that is how they would be writing about it? With no real interest shown in who the enemy was? What do you think their reaction would be afterwards? How would they try to rebuild and prepare for the future? Actually, there's no reaction at all. The next line in the Novgorodian Chronicle is, quote, "The same year, Tverdislav and Fyodor completed the stone church of St. Mikhail." End quote. A few lines later, the entry for 1225 starts, "Knyaz Mikhail, son of Vsevolod, grandson of Oleg, came to Novgorod, and life was easy throughout the district of Novgorod." End quote. Looking across the chronicles, the whole incident with the Mongols, what's usually called the first Mongol invasion of Rus, does not appear to have made any impression at all. Life just goes on. The northeast is enjoying a patch of stability. The south and west continue the endless bickering among the knyazes. It's rather underwhelming for the greatest cavalry raid of all time. So we might ask what Mongol sources can tell us about it. Well, as we heard from Jack Wilson a few episodes back, the main source, The Secret History of the Mongols, only tells us that the Mongols thought the whole affair was so embarrassing they erased it from their history. Even more underwhelming, and it immediately raises the question of what was so embarrassing about it. As a side note, The Secret History has only become available in European languages in the last 50 years or so it's no surprise that the Rus chronicles have dominated our impression of events. But it looks like we have a few holes in the traditional narrative, so let's go back to the beginning and tackle it again. And I think that we will find that recent research sheds some light on what happened. We start off much the same. The Mongols had already encountered the Polovtsi, who are usually referred to as the Cumans in this context, and are, of course, the Kipchak Turks. They met them further east on the steppe while conducting their Central Asian campaigns. The Cumans, who were a loose confederacy without central authority, therefore could not be subjugated by a simple military defeat. As the Mongols moved west, so did the Kipchaks, staying out of their reach. The Mongols had not yet formulated their claim to rule the entire world, but they did claim the steppe. So after the conquest of Khwarezm, Chinggis Khan's leading general, Jebe, proposed taking an army south around the Caspian to come back up on the other side of the Kipchaks and put them in their proper place as subjects of the Great Khan. Subutai was Jebe's protege and went along as his second-in-command. Although all the talk of Subutai as the greatest Mongol general and maybe the greatest general ever is justified by his later career, he was not yet an independent commander. So the purpose of the mission was to subjugate the Kipchaks, and although the envoys from the Mongols to the Rus, who tell them that they have no interest in the Rus and are there for their serfs and horse herds, the Kipchaks, have traditionally often been interpreted as a ruse to split the Allies, they were telling the truth. What of the idea that it was a reconnaissance in force? This idea seems to mostly be based on the fact that the army did a loop around the Caspian and then back through the steppe towards the main Mongol army, and then later the Mongols moved west to conquer. Since this is the Mongols' first trip into the west, it's also obvious they would have learned a lot of new information. That is, this is an after-the-fact interpretation that came from Edward Gibbon and other European historians, who would not have taken the idea that the Mongols were really interested in the Kipchaks rather than the European states particularly seriously, and so came up with an alternative explanation. When we look at how the mission went, it doesn't really support the idea of a reconnaissance. The fact that the Mongols destroyed the Georgian army but then left without forcing their submission is often cited as evidence that this was a scouting raid, but that's a bit of a leap. Actually conquering the Georgian highlands would have been a serious proposition. Members will have heard how the Romans, Persians, and Arabs all failed to do so over the last 1,000 years. However, in Persia and Azerbaijan, they did accept submission and collect tribute. That is, they acted as conquerors where it did not distract them from their mission, and raided in places where conquest might have got them bogged down. They were opportunistic and ready to take advantage of whatever presented itself. So, when they get to the western steppe, the Rus might have no idea who they are, but the Polovtsi do know. And the Polovtsi that are in good relations with the Rus go to them looking for allies. From the Polovtsi reports, the Rus see this as a conflict among steppe peoples that does not directly affect them. They're willing to get involved for the sake of existing alliances to prevent the Mongols taking over their alliance with the Polovtsi, for the gifts and, of course, the promise of further loot. But they do not see the Mongols as a serious threat to Rus. So only the knyazes close to the Polovtsi go, and the others, Susdalia, Novgorod, Pskov, stay on the sidelines. Perhaps seeing this campaign as some of the Rus knyazes joining a Polovtsi fight, rather than being in a serious expedition in the interests of defending Rus, is also behind the Rus failing to appoint an overall leader and properly organize their troops. The combined forces of the Rus and the Polovtsi set out. The Mongols have their intelligence operatives out in the field. That was always one of their strong points. They send word the Rus are coming, and the Mongols start to move east, while still making overtures to the Rus to avoid a fight. The Rus and the Polovtsi catch up to the Mongols, and what is usually described as a rearguard, led by an officer called Genyabek or Hamabek in the Russian chronicles, in the Rus chronicles. We've encountered the word bek before. It's the Turkic word for a commander. The military leaders of the Khazars and Bulgars were called bek. We might ask ourselves why the Rus knew the name of the commanding officer of what was supposedly a small rearguard, and why the Polovtsi were so keen to be allowed to kill him. Historian of the Mongols, Stephen Powell, asked just that question, and then asked, if we go from those Turkic words, Genya or Hama, to Mongolian, what would we get? If you recall our discussions on language way back at the beginning of the podcast, there are rules that govern the way sounds change when words are borrowed between languages. So if we know the end language and we want to know if it could have come from a certain other language, it is possible to reconstruct the derivation. So that's what he did, and the answer he got, which is supported by a consensus of Turkic specialists, was that this must be Jebe, rendered into Kipchak. That is, the Polovtsi told the Rus who was commanding the Mongols, using their variant of General Jebe, Ginyabek. The variations in the chronicle versions of the name can be put down to the Kipchak version being passed back through several Rus messengers to reach the chronicler. If you think back to the extract from the chronicle, the fact that the Rus knew the commander's name and that the Polovtsi really wanted to kill him was not the only strange thing about the story. The Mongols also seemed seriously upset by him being wounded, burying him up to his neck in a kurgan to hide him from the Rus so that they could come back later to get him. Strange treatment for a minor officer. But suddenly it looks different if we assume that Ginyabek was, in fact, Jebe, the commander. This also fits with what we know about Jebe, or rather don't know. The mission set out under Jebe's command, but it returned under Subutai. Jebe is one of Chinggis Khan's closest companions, so he's very much all over the records up to this point, but then he simply disappears, and his biography is missing from the Chinese sources. After the mission returns, there are only a couple of third-hand references to him being somewhere with some people at a couple of different places, which are not considered reliable, and a single throwaway comment that he died of a fever. If he had been caught and killed by the Rus and the Polovtsi, it would explain his disappearance from the record. We move on to the Mongols, now led by Subutai, going on a 9-day feigned retreat across the steppe. Just say that out loud. 9-day feigned retreat. Let's be serious. 9-day feigned retreats don't happen. Let's also not forget here that we're talking about the Polovtsi and Rus, people who have been fighting on the steppe for centuries, absolutely accustomed to steppe fighting tactics, and completely familiar with the advantages of highly mobile cavalry and feigned retreats. This is another narrative that's based on looking back on the Mongols from a later standpoint, where the Mongols and Subutai have become a byword for military success. It does not stand up to scrutiny. A more plausible scenario. The Rus and Polovtsi catch up to the Mongols before they are expected, and before the Mongols have finished their planning to deal with them, while they're still spread out to start their move eastwards. The Polovtsi see Jebe and encourage the Rus to attack while they have the advantage of numbers, overrunning the troops with him and killing the Mongol commander. Subutai takes up command. At this point, he may not be fully informed of what's happening. The Rus have not all arrived, and he may not know what their total numbers are. The loss of Jebe is probably a serious short-term blow to morale. The Mongols are clearly not in battle formation, or Jebe would not have been overrun. A counter-attack could be risky, so instead he sticks to the initial plan, retreat to the east. Not a feigned retreat, an actual retreat, since his army is potentially in serious peril, and certainly not in control of the field of battle. Over the next 9 days, he gets lucky. While he can rely on Mongol discipline to quickly re-establish order in his army, the Rus and the Polovtsi are poorly organized and not talking to each other. The further they go, the more their formations break down. The retreat becomes a search for favourable ground to make a stand and counter-attack. Finally, Subutai finds what he's looking for at the Khalkha. There's some hilly ground, which could be kurgans, and the Rus and Polovtsi have separated into individual contingents strung out over some distance. The Mongols turn and quickly rout the Polovtsi who have run on ahead. They flee back through the Rus coming up behind them, causing chaos, and it all goes south from there. When Mstislav arrives with the main Kievan force, the battle is already lost. He assembles his mobile stockade. Remember, as we previously mentioned, this was one of the things the Rus were known for using, and is besieged by the Mongols. The chronicle says that the Mongols besieging the stockade were led by voivodas Tsiger Khan and Teshu Khan. Voivoda is the Slavonic term for a war leader. I think it's not too hard to see the Khan in those two names, and obviously neither of them is anything like Subutai. Stephen Power has established that these two names are actually the Kipchak forms of Chinggis Khan and Jochi Khan, Jochi or Juchi being the son of Chinggis who was assigned to rule the West. Now, clearly Chinggis and Juchi were not here, so what is going on? We can see in the chronicle that the Rus believed that some kind of truce was reached, where the Mongol leaders kissed the cross to Mstislav of Kiev to let them go. Pow believes that this could be a mangled interpretation of the famous Mongol surrender or die ultimatum. Following this theory, using the Polovtsi as interpreters, the Mongols asked Mstislav, surrounded and outnumbered and on the back foot, who they may have known was nominally the senior Rus knyaz, to submit to Chinggis Khan, the supreme ruler, and Jochi Khan, the ruler of the West. Being unfamiliar with the Mongols, the Rus took this for an offer of truce and asked the Mongols to kiss the cross to seal it, which would have meant nothing to them. The Mongols then killed them because they had fought, instead of surrendering straight away. The Mongols then continued east, on towards the Volga, where they planned to rendezvous with Jochi. There is debate over whether Jochi took over command or Subutai stayed in charge. In any case, they're not out of the woods yet. At this point, they were ambushed by the Bulgars and took heavy losses. This battle is described by the Arab historian Ibn al-Athir. We don't have a Mongol source, but as already noted, they tend to leave out embarrassing incidents. Some Mongol specialists have argued that this never happened. John Chambers even claims the Bulgars made it up. But their arguments seem to demonstrate a lack of knowledge of Bulgaria and simply assume Mongol dominance, so I don't think we need to take them too seriously. Listeners to this podcast should not be surprised by the idea that the Bulgars, capable steppe warriors in their own right, were able to defeat what must by now have been a depleted Mongol force. And so the Mongols departed towards the east, coming, as the chronicle states, from God knows where, and returning to the same place. Some of you familiar with the traditional narrative around the Great Raid, the Rus, and the battle on the Khalkha may disagree with this interpretation, which you can find in some more recent publications, but I think it makes a lot more sense in the wider context. Following the traditional narrative, the question always arises of why the Rus didn't do anything to prepare for a Mongol invasion. If there had been a great battle with tens of thousands of Rus soldiers killed, you would indeed expect them to have reacted in some way. Reading some historians' work, you get the impression that they see the lack of reaction as somewhere between short-sightedness and outright stupidity. If, on the other hand, the Rus joined in what they saw as a conflict between the Polovtsi and another steppe people, one in which the Rus gave a good showing before losing due to their own incompetence, with the knyazes that were involved taking losses, but no indication that this was existential for Rus as a whole, in that case, it would have been quite understandable for them to just carry on as usual afterwards. It was just a lost battle with an enemy that had not been overwhelming, but was running away from the Rus when they met, and continued to run away after. No reason to think that a serious new enemy of the Rus had appeared. Susdalia, Novgorod and Pskov were completely unaffected. The succession in Kiev and Chernihiv was without incident, with Vladimir Rurikovich of Smolensk taking over in the first and Mikhail Vsevolodovich in the second. Mstislav Mstislavich and Daniil Romanovich had escaped and remained knyazes of Halych and Volhynia. The Mongols made no attempt to take any Rus towns or villages, and did not pillage Rus land. They had effectively ended Kipchak power in the steppe, but the Rus were not going to be worried by Polovtsian weakness. So although the first Mongol invasion of Rus and the battle on the Khalkha are often referred to as disastrous for Rus, I think it's hard to say that it rises to that description. If we follow the second narrative that I've laid out here, we can understand why it had no real impact on Rus, and why no one thought they should be planning for the Mongols to reappear. This also lines up with what we can deduce from the Mongol sources. The omission of the raid from the secret history suggests that, unlike Subutais' many modern fans, his contemporaries were less impressed with his successes. We know that Chinggis appears to have been unhappy with Jochi, who was responsible for activities in the West. Subutai advised Chinggis that the West was full of fierce warriors with sharp swords, and when the Mongols debated what to do next, he was in favor of invading China rather than returning to Rus. It would be another 14 years before the Mongols returned to Rus, and the next time they come with an army bigger than anyone in Europe could put in the field. Join me next episode for the real Mongol invasion. Thank you for listening, and until next time, goodbye.